This is the Books Podcast presented by Tim Hague.
In 1 year he wrote 25 novels. 25 novels in 1 year. How the hell did he do it? Every time he slept with a woman, he was still alive.
I ask you, gentlemen of the jury, is this the kind of book you'd like your wives and servants to read?
If I say Georges Simenon, you will say Inspector Maigret. Of course you will. Now, a few years ago, I hadn't read any Simenon, and then I thought I'd give him a go, so I picked up a paperback, and I was promptly hooked. Now, with characteristic good timing, Barry Forshaw has produced a handy little volume for the dabbler in Simenon, and he's with us now. Barry, thank you for joining us again on the Books Podcast.
Looking forward to it.
Well, now, I say dabbling, and with any other author, if I'd read, say 10 books, I might feel I had the measure of the man, but I really haven't scratched the surface, have I?
No, there's no way to. I mean, people did ask me, did I read all 500 novels before I read this book? I read at least half of them again and seen all the films and all the television adaptations. Enjoying Georges Simenon is a lifetime's work.
Yeah, but it's a lifetime of pleasure, isn't it?
Well, it is. He is more than most crime writers utterly reliable. There are no duds. There are a few in which the creative flame is burning lower, but most of them are very reliable.
Let's start with the statistics. Was he the most prolific author ever?
He seems to have been in many ways, because there are several pseudonyms that we don't even know about. And in 1 year he wrote 25 novels. 25 novels in 1 year. How the hell did he do it?
Well, because sometimes he could do it in 2 weeks or 3 weeks, couldn't he?
Indeed. And this is before voice recognition software, unless he had a very good secretary who was writing. That's how Barbara, what was her name?
Oh, Cartland.
Barbara Cartland.
Yeah.
She had a tame secretary and she would dictate all the books. But he's still incredibly prolific.
Yes, but they were subliterate, Barry.
They were indeed, yes. I was being kind and not mentioning that.
So, we've said there are Maigret. There are lots of other books as well. Let's just do some statistics. How many Maigret books were there?
Good question. That would be possibly 75. Is that a test?
Oh, it's not a test. That's what it says in your book.
Oh, right.
I'll tell you what the other ones are.
That's presupposing I've read my own book, though, Tim.
You also tell us there are 117 romans d'heure, which is to say proper novel, hard novels,
novel.
but the ones that he wanted to stand behind, and easily 200 potboilers.
Yes.
And of course, there's all sorts of other writing. That's an amazing output, and he did actually stop at one time, didn't he? He retired, even though he lived to 86 or something.
Well, he didn't seem to have what both Chandler and Fleming, when they got together, would say, how the hell do we kill off this guy? How the hell do we kill off Marlowe or Bond? And then they remember the Conan Doyle lesson. What happens to you when you kill off your cash cow character? But it doesn't appear that Simenon tired of him, but he did think that his best work was in the Roman d'heure.
And of course, Chandler only wrote six novels.
That's
I
all,
think.
yes.
In
fact, if I were doing a mastermind, I'd certainly do Chandler rather than Simenon. Much easier just to read 6 or 7 novels.
Your book is not strictly speaking a biography; it's a different kind of book. What then is it?
It's a collage. I realised I was going to do a collage approach because there are all the films, there are all the books. There's the translators, there is the personal life, which I'm sure you're going to ask me about, and all of that. I thought, well, if I put all that in chronologically, it would become and then he wrote. So I thought the best thing was to deal with the books separately, deal with the films separately.
And you have a section on, and it's not all of the books, it's not, no. but all the important ones, and dozens and dozens and dozens of them, where it tells you a little bit about them, what it's about, and a little potted paragraph which is a really useful checklist. Because here's one of the things: Simenon's quite difficult for the casual reader, isn't he? Because you can lose track of which ones you've read.
Well, you hit the nail on the head there. A lot of people say to me, I don't quite get Simenon. I've read them and they're okay. They're very professionally written. I think the answer to that is you need to read a great chunk of them. You need to read them en masse, and then you get Simenon. If you read just The Big Sleep, you get Chandler. If you read Casino Royale, you get Fleming. But with Simenon, it's an accretion that comes the more of his books you read.
And that's because they're not little sort of puzzle boxes, are they? They're not a straightforward kind of crime thing with a locked room or a poisons or they're not Sherlock Holmesy. They're not solving a riddle.
No, and they're not Agatha Christie. So with Christie, when you're reading one again, you think, oh, it's that one. That's the revelation. And that's fine. She works well on that level. But because he's interested in character and human sympathy, that's the thing that counts rather than plotting.
The thing that everybody knows about Simenon's life is that he claims to have slept with 10,000 women, which is an incredible suggestion. His wife says that was a wild exaggeration. It's only 1,200. But even that's a lot. I mean, it's more than me. I imagine it's more than both of us put together. Do we give any credence to this?
When his son brought up the notion with me, it was about the time, I don't know if you remember this, the English politician Nick Clegg announced that he'd slept with 30 women in his life. And he got a bad press for that because it sounded like boasting.
Was it too many or not enough?
It was just the number. Why did we need to know that he slept with 30 women? And so 10,000 women is a whole different ballgame. And I did say to his son, I'm not sure we really buy it because he was, as you said earlier, very prolific writer. How the hell did he have time?
Well, one thing is the books are quite short for the most part. Mostly they're sort of 35, 40,000 words, aren't they? Which is a shortish novel. I think they have enormous scope and scale, but there must have been some time in between that for sex. And of course, a lot of them would have been prostitutes. He was perfectly happy visiting prostitutes.
A third of them, I believe. I was told that he paid for it a third of the time. I don't know where that puts him on the moral scale, that a third of the time he paid for it. But in fact, two people told me about the whole scenario. One was his publisher, Christopher Sinclair Stevenson. He said that when he would go to see him in France, the first part of the evening would be discussion of rights for the films, who'd been cast as Maigret in whatever country, that's the thing. He said, then the rest of the evening, the wine would be poured, and I had one job, Christopher said, to listen to his conquests of that week. They would be along the lines of, I saw this young waitress, and she clearly was up for it, and so forth. And I said to Christopher, so what was your function? He said, my function was just to sit there and nod approvingly. But he said, it's interesting. I said, well, it's not very admirable, is it? He said, well, I think with him, it wasn't like Michael Douglas's sex addiction. It was a kind of existential thing. Every time he slept with a woman, he was still alive. That might be a justification, but that's what he told me.
Yeah, that sounds a bit French.
You don't buy that.
It sounds a bit French. You quote Christopher Sinclair Stevenson as saying that he was an immensely talented man, but not what he'd call a nice man.
No, he appears not to be nice. And of course, we've got the controversy now over the selling the books to the Vichy government and being essentially a collaborationist, which is why I had to go to America until things...
Because they made movies out of it. The Nazis made movies out of it.
Yes, indeed. And you could argue, I don't know, composers like Richard Strauss, who was master of the Reichsmusik, although he hated the Nazis, but does it matter that you privately object to the regime you're working for? What do artists do in Russia at the moment? People like Shostakovich had to work for Stalin, although he privately disliked the regime. I don't know if it's that easy with Simenon, because maybe he could have left the country. A lot of people left France.
Well, he had various prejudices. It's not just his sex life. He was homophobic as well, wasn't he?
Yes.
He had other prejudices. And I believe that Penguin are doing a new edition of all his books. Are they going to do a Roald Dahl on him and Bowdlerise them?
Well, it's interesting. Josephine Greywood, who I quote in the book, is the editor of the Penguin series. I had attempted to read one of them in French when several of them were only available in French, and my French is pretty woeful, but I got through them. And I noticed certain things. I noticed, for instance, a woman was described in the French as having a dark Semitic appearance. And I said to Josephine, that's not what it says in your translation. And she said, I said to the translators, don't censor it, so it wasn't Roald Dahl. If you can give it a slightly different emphasis. And then, as she said, the word Semitic is not anti-Semitic. But it seems...
Could get you into trouble these days.
It seems tricky these days. So maybe the book...
A sensitivity reader these days would flag it up.
Would have it like a shot. So it isn't like Roald Dahl and Fleming where there are essentially sanitized versions. It's not that at all. And they're very good. The new translations, people like Sean Reynolds, are very good. Not all better than the original Penguins. So, like, I've got a collection over there which is a mixture of the new ones.
You've got lots. I can see them all from here. I should point out, Barry, you very kindly invited us into your flat to record this interview, and we are surrounded on all four sides by books, which is makes me feel very much at home.
You can see they've been read.
Yeah.
But for me, you mentioned the Roman Dieu. I think they are his best work.
I was going to ask that about your relationship, whether you were a Maigret man or a standalone, and you think the Roman Dieu are the ones too.
Well, there's one coming out shortly, Tim, which should be on your list to buy, The Widow Kudelk, and it's translated earlier, just The Widow. It's the book of which Camus said he would not have written The Outsider that if he'd not read the Simenon book. It's about a man who commits a kind of strange, aimless crime, but the whole book builds toward it, whereas The Outsider starts with the crime. And it's wonderfully written, it's bleak, it's existential, it's about sex, it's about lots of things, much more ambitious than one of the Simenon Maigret books.
You've quoted Camus. You also quote André Gide, saying that Simenon was the greatest French novelist of our time. So is he still worth our attention that much? He's the biggest selling crime writer outside of the English language. Mm-hmm. And we'll talk about Maigret in a minute. But was he? I want to ask. He wanted to win the Nobel Prize. Should he have done?
Yes, he was very. I think translating it into English, he said that arsehole Camus won the prize. It should have been me. So he certainly felt that he deserved the top baubles coming his way, and he was very pleased about Gide saying that. I'm not sure it's true, but well, I can only say that when I interviewed the top crime writers in Sweden and Italy, people like Camilleri, Henning Mankell, when I interviewed them at home, they would point to their shelves where there would be, just like there, a complete set of Simenon. All the top crime writers I've met worshipped him. And yet they didn't necessarily write like him. No,
well, nobody did. This is. I'm going to go back to Maigret because he's very much a sort of anti-Sherlock Holmes. He's not like your modern cops. He's not an alcoholic or a maverick, is he? He's bourgeois. He's happily married. He's not especially rebellious. Why is he so compelling?
It's quite interesting. I think a lot is to do with the way. This is how often we mention Fleming in this talk. He is like Fleming in the sense that Bond is everything Fleming wanted to be, but without the cancer. You can still have the lifestyle that Ian Fleming has and still be James Bond. It didn't last very long in Fleming's case. Simenon appears not to have been a very nice man, but he gives this kind of sympathy that he seems to lack himself to his character. So like the American writer Ross MacDonald, the detective is a kind of therapist, is listening to people, is solving people's problems. There isn't the scene that you get in Poirot and Sherlock Holmes where everyone gathers around and everything is explicated. It doesn't go further.
Well, it has been said that Maigret is more psychologist than sort of vengeful investigator.
Well, he also has this interesting sympathy for the underdog, for prostitutes, for instance, who get an interesting ride in to coin a phrase, in the books, which they're always treated with sympathy by Maigret. Even though the girls don't trust him, really, he ends up with scratches and assaults when he tries to be friendly. And that's unusual. That's also being written when Madame de Gaulle was trying to outlaw prostitution.
Do you think visiting the brothels was all just research?
You could read it that way.
Well, you've got another quote that in the book, the inspector does not so much chase clues as decipher tormented minds. We said he's kind of a psychologist. But the way the books work is also very different from that sort of dogged following clues and then opening up the box of tricks.
Yes,
it's been suggested it's like emerging through fog. I always think of it as like, remember when they used to develop photographs and you'd put a page into a bath of chemicals and the picture would sort of become sharp.
Emerge, yes.
I find the Maigret novels do that for me. There's never a point at which he goes, and that is because I can show you this telegram prove. He never does that.
No. It's closer to an influence on him, which was Dostoevsky. So if you remember Crime and Punishment, Porphyry, who is like Columbo, he just kind of doggedly whirs away at things until finally, okay, you got me. But there's never a big moment of revelation, and that's the kind of detective he is. He doesn't really write police procedurals as we understand them today.
And yet, if you go to Paris, you can go to where his office was, the 36 Quai d'Offray.
Quai des Orfèvres.
D'Orfèvres, thank you. Is there on the Ile de la Cité on the other end from Notre Dame, and there are 146 steps. It's all very grounded. It's not police procedural, but it's very physically grounded.
It is indeed, and that's one of the elements that works so well in the book. Also, speaking of influences, in a way, he's slightly like Hemingway, that there aren't long descriptions with exotic filigrees of description. It's basic, it's cut down, it's pared down, but just enough to evoke Paris or other parts of France.
Must make it very difficult to translate, though, because the prose is incredibly spare. In order to get all of that into 40,000 words.
Well, interesting you say that. So I know personally quite a few of his translators, one of whom I was a best man for many years ago. So I've interviewed all of them, as you said, it's in the book. They all approached it in a different way, but apparently they were all taken to a chateau, they tell me. Josephine Greenwood took them all on holiday to France, all the translators she'd then hired, and they had a conference because there had to be unity to the books. There couldn't be one translator whose style was utterly different from the others.
Well, yeah, we can. I can see why it might be desirable to have all the translations in a particular style, and then that's one way of doing it, get everybody together. Madame Simenon, though, had quite strong feelings about what would happen to her husband's books as well. She was a bit of a what did you call her?
Well, various animal kingdom denizens were
all with teeth.
Yes, which various translators of the past would deal with. They hated dealing with her. She was kind of like, a lot of authors have this. You will know this, Tim, because you dealt with so many authors. The spouse from hell. So the spouse is allowed to do all the dirty work, and the husband or the wife will say, sorry, what can I do? She's always like this. She was the one who would insist. She had a very curious insistence in terms of translation, that it had to be as close to the original French as possible. But because that's, how long is a piece of string?
Yeah, that's nonsense. That's not what translation is.
But then she would just say, no, this is too far from what Georges wrote, or that's okay. Certainly publishers found it difficult to deal with. Translators didn't. And now we have the current batch of translators for whom she's not around.
But he was still alive when she was doing this, although
Yes,
she outlived him, didn't
Yes.
she, by 8 years, I think you say.
She was aware of the value of translation, which is fair enough. And I think only in recent years has translation become an art in itself, in the fact that certain translators in Britain, writers abroad, wait for them to be available, because they know they will get a really deluxe job on their book if they wait for certain translators.
Did he make a big chunk of his money from translation?
Yes, well, he was a canny businessman. So the translations, the films, the TV, in a way, he monetized or allowed people to monetize his product, which is fine.
Well, then let's talk about Maigret on film, because that's quite an important thing. There have been a lot of screen presentations of Maigret, and so we're going to talk about some of them. There've been you've got a list of movies of the books, and I read through it and I said, I've never seen any of these movies. They seem to me to be very obscure. Some of the television stuff I've seen, of course. Have I just not been paying attention?
No, you're right. That a lot of the really important. It took me a while to track down Charles Laughton doing him on The Man on the Eiffel Tower. Now you would think he'd be right, because Maigret is stocky.
Yes.
Charles Laughton's stocky.
Charles Laughton was pudgy, though.
Well, yes, he was fatter.
You
Yes,
don't
that's
think
a
of
good point.
Maigret as pudgy.
Right, you've got very specific ideas about his weight, but
You're right.
But it didn't work because, in fact, Laughton, wonderful though he is always an actor who's constantly drawing attention to himself with actorly tricks, bodily movements, the eyes narrow. Peter Cushing did the same. He knows how to use the body that keeps you mesmerised. That's not Maigret. Maigret has to be slightly more blank, so that you're
almost a stillness in the middle of the action, because he's quite often just watching what happens, or his action will be to go from his lodgings down to the cafe and have a drink, and then the plot will unfold around him.
Yes. In fact, one of the best is Jean Gabin, which is available, so look out for those. Gabin plays him almost. In fact, it's interesting. Several actors would apparently say that Simenon would always say to them, "You are my Maigret. You're my Maigret." He said it to Rupert Davis in this country. He said it to Jean Gabin. And Henning Mankell told me that when the various actors who played Wallander, or Wallander as he was called in this country, he would say to them all, "You're my Wallander, you're my Wallander." So it's just good manners, maybe.
Maybe, although I think we give it some credence when it's Rupert Davis, don't we? Now I've never seen those. They broadcast "I Learned from Your Book" between 1960 and 1963, so it's slightly before my time. Although I saw on I was Forces TV or one of those stations right at the bottom of the list where we're doing them now, which is good news. But Simenon liked Rupert Davis.
Yes, he did appear to like him, and it was very good. When you look at them again, Network, the DVD company, has issued the whole lot. It's interesting that you will see constant shots of Rupert Davis walking down the Rue de la Paix or whatever. Those pickup shots were filmed specially. Rupert Davis would go over and film a few shots walking. Everything else,
nice work if you can get it.
Nice work if you can get it, but it's shot in Elstree. All the interiors are all shot in England. And you have that curious thing with all of these things now is that when place names come up, everybody's speaking English, but they have to pronounce that. It's very tricky.
Quai de d'Orfèvre.
Yeah, that suddenly appears in the sentence. But they don't say, as American films used to do, "I think he's at the Arch of Triumph." They don't do that because that really doesn't work at all. The nearest that got to solving it was my favourite TV Maigret, which is Michael Gambon.
Which was filmed in Hungary, in Budapest.
Yes.
Not Elstree, but it's still not Paris.
Exactly, as so many things are. That seems to be a city that will do for 19th century London. Or...
Gambon was right. He was the right side. He's a big physical man who could stand still if he needed to.
Well, he had that. I saw him on stage in Arthur Miller's View from the Bridge.
I saw that too. I saw that production, yes.
And he'd had that literal weight, but also the metaphorical weight. So obviously Maigret is not a physical, there are no fist fights or gun battles. He doesn't go there.
No, but he does intimidate people.
He does intimidate.
I remember a scene in one of them where he he makes his sergeant stand on a wall looking through a window all night while Maigret goes off to bed.
Yes.
I mean, you wouldn't be able to do that if you were a weedy little bloke, would you?
That's a good point, isn't it? I thought he was the best. And also that series is interesting now to look at because it's full of people like Michael Sheen, who are now big names, who were then just starting in the career. So it's very well cast. So of all the
And it looked nice. It had a good production
yeah.
value.
Although, in fact, it now looks, because it's Academy ratio, so we see that square screen now that always shrieks elderly TV, doesn't it? We're so used to widescreen. But I think of all the non-Indigenous ones, that was the best.
Most recent one, of course, is Rowan Atkinson, which I thought was a disaster.
Well, you saw what I said about that. And the problem was that Rowan Atkinson wanted the gig, he got it, but then he had to say to everyone, look, I'm not a comic.
I'm not going to be funny.
Yeah, I'm not going to be funny. Whereas, of course, Maigret
It's kind of like John Lennon making records with Yoko Ono and saying, what am I good at? Well, I won't do that then.
Exactly. Well put. But it doesn't work at all because Maigret becomes a humorless figure the way he's played by Rowan Atkinson, who's an acceptable actor, but he's trying too hard not to be Rowan Atkinson.
And he doesn't have the presence, he doesn't have the physical presence. I mean, he's marvellous in the right thing.
Yes.
But you either have to be able to act big, or you have to have the sheer heft in the first place.
Well, a lot of people said to me, "Oh, I don't like Maigret." And that's probably because I don't like Rowan Atkinson, and I would say, well, that's kind of like saying you don't like James Bond because he's played by an actor called Barry Nelson. Do you remember that?
The very first James Bond
in Casino Royale. So you don't judge the character on whoever's playing him at any given time, do you?
You'd hope not, and yet, of course, people do, because people think they've read Pride and Prejudice because they saw it on television, don't they? Which is a problem for those of us who think books matter.
Yes, but I sometimes wonder. I'm always pleased to hear when people say their children read, but I hear quite a lot of bookish types saying their children don't read anymore. So I'm hoping the former is true.
Yeah, let's hope the former is true. Well, with that in mind, finally, I'm going to ask you to nominate one Maigret and one Roman d'Or. If anybody goes, oh, they're right, I should have read Simenon, where should they start?
Well, as we are recording this, The Widow Kudak has not yet appeared, except it will appear shortly in hardback. So possibly wait for the paperback if you want. Mm-hmm. And for the reasons I've just said, that's... It's a book basically about sex, in which the sex is totally non-erotic. Nobody could ever be aroused by The Widow Kudak, however graphic it is. And the other roman d'Or is The Man Who Watched Trains Go By, which is about a man's descent into madness and paranoia and criminality and murder.
Well, after reading your book, that's the next one I'm going to read.
Yes, and then difficult to say what I would pick. I'm going to take the fifth on that because I don't want to pick any one Maigret book.
Okay.
I think they're all any one book doesn't give you the idea. Possibly start with Pieter the Latvian.
The first one.
Yeah, the very first one. It's a good place to start. But it doesn't tell you everything there is to know about Simenon. You might say, is that it? Is that really what people are talking about? You need to persevere.
Okay. Well, I think we will, and I'm going to. And you already have. You said you've read about half of them, or
Yes.
you reread half of them.
Well,
have you read all of them at one time?
Over the years, I must have read about 9/10.
Crumbs.
There are several which I've still to get round to. And that's rather good.
Oh, yes. You want
So for years with Thomas Hardy, I kept leaving, because he was always a favourite. I left The Woodlanders.
Mm-hmm.
I hadn't read it, so I wanted to say one book that I could read, but then I'd read them all. And then you could reread them.
With me, it's Graham Greene. I've got one or two that I haven't read yet, and I'm just saving them up because you don't want to have run out of Graham Greene.
Well, that's interesting. Greene is in some ways is like Simenon. He doesn't have been a particularly nice man. He didn't treat his lovers well, but the books are full of human sympathy, as with Simenon.
Well, Barry, thank you very much for pointing me to all of that. It was a large pleasure, and your book is not only a pleasure but very useful. And it is Simenon, The Man, the Books, the Films by Barry Forshaw, and it's £12.99 from Oldcastle Books, which I think is a bargain.
Not bad, is it?
It's not bad. Thank you, Barry.
Thank you, Tim.
That was Books Podcast, presented by Tim Haig. Books Podcast is a Green Shoot production. You can find out more at www.green-shoot.com, and Tim can be contacted on tim@green-shoot.com.